learners, and welcome to the 45th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. In the last minute or so of the previous lecture, I introduced very briefly the name of the writer and the novel that I would be beginning to discuss in the next lecture, and that is Marilynne Robinson. The name of the writer is Marilynne Robinson, and the book is Housekeeping. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, this was published in the year 1980 and has quietly acquired the status of a cult novel. I say cult because it has quietly acquired the status of a sort of a legend or a personal favorite among many scholars and writers, and it has slowly built up over the years a massive critical reputation as well. There have been several articles, book chapters, and studies devoted to this novel, even though in the career of the writer, Marilynne Robinson, it doesn't appear to play as big a role as some of her more popular novels, which is the Gilead series. This novel appeared in 1980, and 2005 onwards, Robinson has been publishing a series of novels dedicated to describing the fortunes of one family. That is the Gilead series, and that can be called something of a prestige fiction or very, very highly regarded literary fiction by a highly regarded novelist. Nonetheless, Housekeeping holds its place as an indispensable document in the history of 20th century America. It's an indispensable document not only because it is the early and sort of debut and sophomore work of a novelist who would later go on to be recognized as a very influential and masterly writer. So not just for those who are curious about the career of Marilynne Robinson, but also as a document of historical value. I say historical value because this novel describes in great detail and with a very lyrical sensibility the historical changes that several American writers and historians would later go on to struggle to describe. And what is that historical development? It is, to speak in a summary style, the move from industrial to post-industrial American society. This can also be described as a shift from capitalist to post-capitalist, or from modernist to postmodernist, depending on what kind of cultural, social, or economic history one is wanting to write and what sort of a discipline one is coming from. So, literary historians, but also cultural historians and also philosophers have all tried to reconcile this very important shift that took place, not just in the US, but all across the developed first world. So I'll discuss a little bit of theory in order to explain what this shift is, and then I'll also discuss a little bit of literary fiction to describe how novelists have revisited and described the shift. But before I do any of that, I want to read the first few pages from Housekeeping to give you all a sense of what it feels like to experience this novel. This is one of my most favorite novels, and I'm actually very happy that I'm getting to teach this and to talk about this. In fact, the desire to read and to discuss this novel was among the motivations for designing this course in the first place. So I really want to be seen as an advocate for simply reading this novel more than anything else, more than an interpretation of this novel or more than an understanding of this novel. What I believe most readers would benefit from is simply immersing themselves in the style and the mode and really the world that this novel creates. So I want to read from the novel and then make some comments about it, and then zoom out into a theoretical and cultural history. So this is how housekeeping begins, and I'm reading Marilynne Robinson. Chapter 1. My name is Ruth. I grew up with my younger sister, Lucille, under the care of my grandmother, Mrs. Sylvia Foster, and when she died, of her sisters-in-law, Mrs. Lily and Nona Foster, and when they fled, of her daughter, Mrs. Sylvia Fisher. Through all these generations of elders, we lived in one house, my grandmother's house, built for her by her husband, Edmund Foster, an employee of the railroad, who escaped this world years before I entered it. It was he who put us down in this unlikely place. He had grown up in the Middle West in a house dug out of the ground, with windows just at earth level and just at eye level, so that from without the house was a mere mound, no more a human stronghold than a grave, and from within the perfect horizontality of the world in that place foreshortened the view so severely that the horizon seemed to circumscribe the sod house and nothing more. So my grandfather began to read what he could find of travel literature, journals of expeditions to the mountains of Africa, to the Alps, the Andes, the Himalayas, the Rockies. He bought a box of colors and copied a magazine lithograph of a Japanese painting of Fujiyama. He painted many more mountains, none of them identifiable if any of them were real. They were all suave cones or mounds, single or in heaps or clusters, green, brown, or white, depending on the season, but always snow-capped, these caps being pink, white, or gold, depending on the time of day. In one large painting, he had put a bell-shaped mountain in the very foreground and covered it with meticulously painted trees, each of which stood out at right angles to the ground, where it grew exactly as the nap stands out on folded plush. Every tree bore bright fruit, and showy birds nested in the boughs, and every fruit and bird was plump with the warp in the earth. Oversized beasts, spotted and striped, could be seen running unimpeded up the right and unhastened down the left. Whether the genius of this painting was ignorance or fancy, I could never decide. I'll stop there, although one feels like going on, but I'll stop there and point out a few things. So the first, let's say about 8 to 10 lines, making about the first 2 or 3 long sentences, present a very peculiar picture of a family and present this novel or this document, this roughly 200-page document that we are just beginning to read, as a chronicle of a family, as a family history. And the use of proper names is very crucial to this. The narrator begins with a very short sentence, just 4 words, "My name is Ruth." This short sentence is followed by an extremely long sentence divided into several subclauses and almost diagrammatically inviting the reader or challenging the reader to keep track of the sentence structure. The next long sentence compresses into itself, into a single thought, 3 generations of this family, but also the kind of care that the narrator has grown up in, and what are the reasons for that kind of care. So it's not a simple story at all. In fact, there are suggestions of darker things hinted at, but not quite spelled out. So what are these darker things? The first dark thing is that the narrator's grandmother, Sylvie Foster, once she died, her sisters-in-law fled. And we're not told why they fled, but it seems to me that there is a story here, and the sentence invites readers to acknowledge and think about what might be the causes for this. But the narrator moves on and ends this sentence with key information, that is the name of her aunt, Mrs. Sylvia Fisher, right? So from Sylvia Foster, we come to Sylvia Fisher. And we get more information, which is that the house in which these multiple generations of women have lived and in which Ruth and Lucille have been cared for solely by women was given to or built for Ruth's grandmother by Ruth's grandfather, whose name also is spelled out, Edmund Foster. And one key information here is that he was an employee of the railroad. And after these first three sentences, the focus shifts entirely to Edmund Foster. And beyond the sentences that I read, the next few pages are devoted entirely to the life of this grandparent, Mr. Edmund Foster. That description starts on the very first page when we are told that he grew up in the Midwest. And from the Midwest, we are told, through his work with the American Railroad, he moved to the West. So the Midwest and the Pacific Northwest, these are the beginning and the end points of the journey that Edmund Foster undertakes. The Midwest is used to refer to states such as Illinois, Minnesota, and some other states around the Great Lakes area. And the Pacific Northwest refers to states such as Washington and Oregon. Now, this movement is a very important and momentous movement in the history of the American nation. The bulk of this movement took place in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, when, running out of opportunities, Americans began to civilize or humanize and domesticate the landscape of the Pacific Northwest. And the first and the biggest process which constituted this process of civilizing and domesticating the landscape was the establishment of railroads, establishment of railway tracks. And this involved a lot of labor, a lot of physical labor, for which men and some women, mostly men from different degrees of poverty, disenfranchisement, civil disability, disabled, poor, disenfranchised men from all over the country, but also all over the world, came to this part of America to sell their labor and to build the railroad. Edmund Foster is one among those many male laborers. He's not terribly poor, so he's not working entirely or solely with the labor of his body. He is somewhat higher up in the process, so he's between a blue collar and a white collar employee. And we are told in the pages that follow, which I'm not going to read just now, we're told how he was bored of living in the flat Midwest. I just read this description of his house, which was partly in the ground, and the view from the house was locked in. And he was fascinated and obsessed with mountains to the extent that he got picture books and atlases and drew pictures of mountains from as far away as Fujiyama in Japan. And so, bored and looking for mountains, this man, he boards the train, right, from somewhere in Illinois, and tells the conductor or the train operator that he wants to go to a place where there are mountains. And so this conductor decides to play some sort of a trick and takes him all the way to the Pacific Northwest. Ruth, the narrator, tells us that it's a bit of a joke because there are bigger mountains, more spectacular sceneries, and really, if one was looking for mountains, the Pacific Northwest would not be the first destination that would come to mind. Nonetheless, this is where the train operator takes Edmund Foster, possibly because that was the only place where Edmund Foster was likely to find stable and sustained employment. The narrator tells us that before Edmund Foster got off the train, he had already secured employment in the railroad company. Within 6 years of this, he is able to move very high up in the ranks of the railroad company and is able to secure for himself and his family a house, which is the house that Ruth and Lucille are living in at the moment. Now, very soon after this, Edmund Foster dies in a railroad accident. This accident takes up a fairly substantial amount of the text, and we're given a very moving description of the accident. It's moving because nobody actually saw it happen, and this is something the narrator tells us in as many words. Nobody saw it happen because the train simply fell off a bridge into the river in the middle of the night, and it was a moonless night. So it was a cold, cloudy, and icy night in which the train simply slid off the bridge, possibly because there was ice on the tracks. And this was the early days of the railroad. And it was impossible to even retrieve the bodies because of how cold the water was. In fact, we get this very vivid description of how the boys and the men, the swimmers who volunteer to dive into the river to try and retrieve the bodies, they're not able to stay underwater for more than a minute or so because the water is freezing. So we get these descriptions of these swimmers going into the water and coming back in a minute and then being quickly wrapped in blankets because otherwise they would die of hypothermia. But they keep doing this, and even this they're able to do only for a very short window once the sun rises. And we're told that even once the sun rises, the clouds take up the sunshine, so there's actually very little light. And in this extremely hostile and forbidding climate, the search for these bodies is abandoned, and there is a sort of a commemoration ceremony that takes place on the bridge itself, and wreaths are thrown from the bridge onto the ice-covered river as a way of remembering these brave souls who had served the railroad company and who gave their lives in this very tragic incident. So that's a small summary of what we read in the first few pages. Now, I describe this for two reasons. So the first thing I notice in this novel, and I hope that everyone who's watching this will read the novel and will notice this one particular feature about the style of the sentences and the style of the description in this novel. The descriptions are quite lyrical. We get many metaphors, and the description of the sunshine, of the clouds, of the snow, of the river, as I summarize briefly, they're taken from an early 20th century poem. They are not sentimental, but they are quite lyrical, and the metaphors are actually quite rich. So they're inspired by the Romantic era descriptions of nature, but they're also inspired by the early 20th century American poets' very clinical description of these nature images. So I'm thinking of Robert Frost and Wallace Stevens, who describe nature in a way that a doctor or a scientist would describe them. There's a lot of that happening in Housekeeping. But there's also something else, which is the autobiographical first person perspective of Ruth. Now, in that narration, there's two things. The first thing is the spareness or the minimalism of the sentences and the style. The second is a very, very objective and clinical acknowledgement of the centrality of women to this family's history, to also the site and the location of this family. The second sentence announces to us that the several generations of people consisted only of women, and for some reason, men are absent. These reasons will become clear to us as we read the novel, but this is an important and undeniable aspect of this novel. Many scholars have read this novel as a feminist manifesto of sorts, as one of the great American feminist novels, if I can coin such an expression. That description, I think, is a little bit overstated, and I will explain why I feel that is the case. I'm leaning on the most recent interpretation and study of this novel by Sarah Wasserman, which I find to be the most persuasive. Wasserman's reading of this novel comes from her book, The Death of Things, Ephemera and the American Novel, Minnesota Press 2020. I'll delve a little more deeply into Wasserman's argument shortly, but for now, I want to mention that the minimalism and the woman-centric perspective are among the more important things in this novel. The second thing about this novel that's important is the relationship between this very public and material history of the civilization of America through the building of railroads, a history to which Ruth is connected through the life and fate and through the laboring life of her grandfather, Edmund Foster. This part, the material and public railroad construction part of America, is connected to more feminine and private and domestic history of the 20th century, which is the maintenance of the private space through labor, which was frequently assigned to women, and the assignment and such assignment, which at some point in the middle of the 20th century began to be resisted by several discerning women writers. So there is the assignment of domestic labor to women, there is the articulation of resistance to such assignment, which I think gives the novel this title, Housekeeping. A key critical question that the novel forces its readers to ask is, who should perform this labor of housekeeping? Should it be naturally assigned to women? What are the injustices, or what is unfair about assigning such duty to women? Should it be a choice, or should it be seen as a natural biological duty? So these are some very obvious questions from feminist theory of the late 20th and early 21st century. Philosophically, one can say that these questions come from Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, but they begin to be articulated much more specifically, and specifically in the context of caregiving in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, in which feminist scholars begin to articulate these questions. In 1980, this novel, Housekeeping, in some ways, therefore, can be said to anticipate and inaugurate and lay the fictional and therefore the humanistic possibilities and foundations for beginning to articulate these critical questions about the assignation of duties of domestic labor. This is all very relevant. But what is most interesting about this novel is how it arrives at this place of articulating these critical feminist questions about labor and the performance of housekeeping, how it enables these questions to be asked through a representation of a material history of America. Now, and that I think the novel earns through its description of this railroad employee and this very moving and very detailed description of this accident, which is tragic, but it was very common, and that connects this novel to several other important cultural as well as theoretical reflections on American history. Now, some of these cultural texts are novels and films, and these theoretical reflections are works by scholars of postmodernist and Marxist lineage. The cultural texts that I will briefly mention in order to help flesh out this connection are the novel Look at Me by Jennifer Egan and the novella Train Dreams, which was recently also made into a film on Netflix, which released, I think, a few months before. The theoretical texts which are important for understanding this transition are many, but most powerfully, I think, Frederick Jameson's 1993 text, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. When I discuss Jameson's postmodernism text, I will, of course, connect it to a whole tradition of reflection on materiality and how cultures describe materials and commodities, and how that history is extremely important for us to understand both the history of the 20th century as well as the history of literary production. I'll stop here and continue with this discussion in the next lecture. Thank you.